This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Loaded for speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. It's your girl BK, and join with me as my amazing co-host, Manly Jack Manley. How are you doing, Jack?
How is it going, BK? I am doing pretty well. A fond, if belated, Thanksgiving. I got my fill of some good food this weekend. I hope you did as well, BK.
Yes, I definitely was resting up and grubbing up. So I hope everyone has been having a lovely holiday season as we kind of get started into that.
What better way to bring film nerds back from this holiday break than with one that we can really sink our teeth into, I think.
Oh yeah, we are going to be talking about a very interesting film, and that is the one of the the strong vipers, the graceful snakes, the mighty.
You refuse to say this name correctly, BK. I do not understand, but I respect it, I guess.
Yes, I am sorry. Here, we'll say it once for the pot. We are talking about Monty Python's Life of Brian, 1979, one of our favorite years here on the podcast. And Jack, I know that is your favorite year of film.
Really, this podcast is just a soft run for me writing a book in 2029 as a 50-year anniversary to the greatest year in film. But I digress. Yes, we are talking today about Terry Jones's film, written by the other Pythons, Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, along with Jones. And BK, I really was very, very excited to show this to you and to share this with our community, because we just kind of have to say it off top. Life of Brian is widely regarded as one of the best made and funniest comedies of all time.
I would love to corroborate, but this is quite frankly probably maybe my third or fourth comedy I've ever watched, and I'm a little sad and disappointed in myself, but I'm thrilled to be able to talk about it and to dive into these films, because comedies is a genre that I am not very fond with or well versed in. And when I tell you, being thrown into the world that is Life of Brian and in the minds of those Monty Pythonians, I have been overwhelmed, Jack. Like, what an amazing pick for us to get into.
Well, it's actually, I think, kind of an elegant film if you're not somebody who's into comedy to start your journey, because it's really based in the world of parody and lampoon, taking serious real-world concepts and putting them into a really intelligent satiric form. I mean, let's be real. The film centers around a guy named Brian living in the time of the Roman occupation of Jerusalem, and there's no way around it, BK. He's living an exactly parallel life to Jesus of Nazareth. The only problem is he has no desire to be a Messiah, despite the fact that he actually has some pretty good messages about solidarity and people believing in peace and love. It's a really interesting subversion of the New Testament era.
I was quite literally flabbergasted, Jack, when we were watching this, and I'm just like unprepared for what it was or what it should be. And when I realized, and it took me a while, like, unfortunately, I should have realized at the beginning, where they do the bait and switch of the manger sets and are like, hey, this is the manger next door to Jesus. I actually kind of took a while to realize that it was a parallel of the story. But the fact that that is the premise really breeds for some amazing parody and phenomenal comedy.
I gotta say, since you were a first-time viewer, I'm very curious. How did you end up coming away from the film? Like, what did you take away from this? What was the experience like seeing this for the first time as kind of a comedy newbie?
I definitely had to kind of let myself go. And I think everyone keeps saying that when it comes to comedy, especially the Monty Python peeps, because their comedy always goes just a little further than like I think my tastes were ready for. And I kind of needed to like put that barrier down and just enjoy it for what it is. And I had a really good time. I had my, little tiffs about certain things that maybe are a little bit outdated. But overall, the story and the execution, as like a movie fan, I was very impressed with the translation. I very well know the story of Jesus. I come from a very religious household. So to kind of see those motifs and to see comedy that is joking about the things around the story and not the story and the morals of Jesus Christ himself was, for me, very amazing artistry. Like, this is something that I've never really experienced before. That is parody and comedy around a very important taboo subject.
Well, I think that kind of gets to the core of who the Pythons were as a creative collective. Monty Python's Flying Circus, the show that ran from 1969 to 1972 in England, is probably the most monumental happening in scripted and sketch comedy in history, to the point where there is the old style of semantic and sketch comedy, and then after the Pythons, there is everything that the Pythons influenced, and there is nothing else. In terms of groundswells of ways of changing comedy and turning it on its head and examining the art form, Monty Python, it's like looking at an Andy Warhol painting or a Jackson Pollock. It's like listening to Jimi Hendrix rip off a guitar solo that comes from a place that you can't understand. It is artists expressing their reaction to an art form. I know I'm waxing poetic in ways that are unnecessary about very silly comedy, but at the end of the day, I think it's important to understand as we're getting into this podcast that Monty Python is a monument to comedy, not just because the show is really funny and something that people go back and review, but because it established comedy as what it has been in the modern era for its type. It's shocking because it's the birth of a new view on how the comedic art form can be used, BK.
I was going to ask, I don't really know many different types of comedy. I feel like the only comedy that I know is Chris Tucker and Eddie Murphy, very comedic stand-up. I'm not someone who's versed in comedy in film. I mean, I was first exposed to it by watching Airplane, really. I think the only equivalent film I had is a parody of that film, which is Snakes on a Plane. Might be a modern day take on the classic Airplane, but that's as far as my lens goes. So I guess in short, to kind of bring people on who might be as unengaged as me, is where does comedy kind of originate from? Is there some sort of source? Is there something that the Monty Pythons pulled from? Are they doing something very different than how it used to be in the past? Is that a weird question, Jack?
No, it's not, because comedy, honestly, at the late 60s and the 70s was evolving in two different traditions that I think are both worth examining. Because there was this one tradition that is divorced from what Monty Python is doing, where guys like George Carlin and Richard Pryor were pushing this envelope of this really new art form called stand-up, where the comedy was all about the artists who were performing the comedy would engage directly with the audience and their emotional reactions and evolve to that in their routines in real time. That's not Python. Python is highly regimented, highly scripted, old-style comedy. I mean, these are routines that would not be all that removed from the Three Stooges or the Marx Brothers or Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello. They work within that highly scripted, highly semantic world. The difference is they took that comedic model in the late 60s and early 70s and they turned it on its head by making the semantics point out kind of the grotesque and absurd and silly things about society. They turned a mirror onto the public at large, particularly in England at that time, and they found a way to make people laugh at themselves and take themselves less seriously as a result, despite the fact that the process of taking yourself less seriously often means going through some very problematic and offensive ground. And that was the envelope they pushed that nobody had gone over before. And it's a tribute really to the fact that these were guys that knew each other, BK. They had pre-established relationships before Python ever came together that allowed them to push the envelope.
I see it. I realize I'm sitting here and you're telling me the history of comedy. I go, I know I've seen more comedy somewhere. I know it. I like funny stuff. I'm on the internet. And it clicked with me. And I know the modern day, this is a rant and a subtangent because I got to get it out here right now. But Key and Peele totally pull from this. And they do the same sketch work. So I see it now. Once you said scripted, I went, oh my God, light bulb. There it is. It's sketch humor, which is like stuff we grew up on. I mean, all that and things like that were all scripted. My mind is Bojack. Okay. So back to the Mighty Snake people. Where did they come together? Okay. How did they knew each other? Were they friends? Were they homies? Did they go to school together? Like, were they friends from the get-go?
They weren't friends from the get-go, but their upbringings and their coming together was, at least for the 5 British Pythons, appropriately British. These were kids who all started out as decidedly working class. Some of them were sent away to boarding schools. Some of them were stuck in England's grammar schools at the time. But they all worked very hard and very studiously to earn places at Oxford and Cambridge. Oxford is where Michael Palin and Terry Jones would come together actually as comedy writers when Palin did a sketch for an Oxford Christmas party and Terry Jones took notice. By the same token, Cambridge would be where Graham Chapman, John Cleese, and Eric Idle would all connect through the Cambridge University Footlights Club, a famed comedic troupe within the university that specialized in sketch and semantic humor. So these guys were starting into this comedy grounding around very serious studies. Like, Graham Chapman was doing this sketch writing with John Cleese while he was studying to be a doctor.
Okay, when I learn about stories of these people, I go, okay, well, maybe one day I can be as creative as these people and find a group of like-minded individuals that we can like get together and make a crazy comedy group. This isn't real, Jack. This isn't real. This is like an anime story to me. Like, no way.
Well, it gets even more serendipitous than that because all of these guys got noted in comedic circles in Britain at this time, particularly in the early 60s, and they would get their opportunities to do this kind of writing and performance out in the wild on television, doing both sketch writing and performance for shows like The Frost Report and Do Not Adjust Your Set, and my personal favorite title, Finally the 1948 Show. This really was where they started working in writers' rooms and developing a reputation within the British Broadcasting Corporation for doing solid comedic work. And this would all result in their opportunity to come together when Graham Chapman and John Cleese were pitched a 2-man show that they desperately did not want to keep constrained to just themselves.
Interesting. So BBC was like, yo, we want you to do this 2-man show. And they're like, absolutely not. We need more people. We want to, play off of more people? I mean, 2-man show, that's a lot of pressure on 2 people.
Not only that, but Chapman and Cleese, despite the fact that they wrote brilliantly together, did always have tensions as writing partners and little things about each other, particularly Chapman as somebody who saw himself as an actor and as a strong leading man. There was tension there that made the writing process difficult for them, so they couldn't just constrain it to themselves. They needed the other pieces to work with to have any staying power. And so John Cleese reached out to Michael Palin, who coincidentally was working on a series of his own at the time with Terry Jones, Eric Idle, and the newly moved in expatriate from America, Terry Gilliam, all of whom had been working previously on Do Not Adjust Your Set. And Palin loved what he was pitched from Cleese, and all 6 of them came together. And this was, in so many words, the genesis of Monty Python's Flying Circus. All of this happenstance and good fortune within a burgeoning television industry in England at the time gave them this platform as kind of ridiculous, silly, creative people to be given the keys to the kingdom sight unseen.
I would have lost my mind if, as a creative, being able to be like, hey, look, here's your playground. What do you need? Let's make it happen. Insane to me. Now I want to go ask all my family in the UK about Monty Python. I feel so out of the loop. I can't believe I didn't know about this. I'm invested. So what happens next? They're doing TV stuff. How do you make the jump from TV to movies?
Well, after kind of a lukewarm response to the first couple episodes, it blew up into this incredible cult show that was noted for fitting its satire into wackiness rather than doing that vice versa. They were silly where so much else was self-serious. And this resonated with the public to the point where there were entrepreneurs in the UK, like one Victor Launis, the head of Playboy UK, who wanted to give these guys an audience in places beyond the island. So he devised the 1971 film, and now for something completely different, as a mishmash. It's basically 90 minutes of a Monty Python episode, and put that in theaters for Americans to be introduced to this comedy troupe. And it blew them up, despite the fact that it wasn't a very fun filming process. It resulted in America absolutely embracing and falling in love with the Pythons and giving them this kind of clout that they needed to make their own original feature, which, of course, finally happens in 1975 when they would make Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Oh, that's the one that everyone knows. That's like the famous one, right? The one.
That's the one with all the quotes. That's the one where people will rant about it endlessly. You've got the right film in your head.
Okay, this is the part where everyone goes, wow, Monty Python. Okay, sorry. Everyone hates me now. All of our listeners are rolling over in their seats. Okay, so this is a big deal. I'm trying to be hype. Big deal. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. We've made it here. And then... I'm curious. It's successful, clearly. So does that just pave the way for more films here? Does Life of Brian just kind of birthed at the end of that success, just running on the momentum? Or is there something else that kind of triggers the creation of the film that we ended up watching?
It dovetails very kind of seamlessly with the start of Life of Brian. They had just gone through this very acrimonious set to make Holy Grail. It was not a fun experience. They had no money. Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam were both first-time directors who, by and large, did not get along. Graham Chapman, who was playing King Arthur, was almost perpetually drunk in the throes of his struggle with alcoholism at the time. So they were really kind of just in a place where they were burnt out and they wanted to get away from each other, go back to solo projects. And yet the press kept asking them, oh, what's going to be Monty Python's follow-up? What's going to be Monty Python's follow-up? And Eric Idle finally got sick of being asked this by journalists and industry types alike. And so he came up with the fake title, Jesus Christ Lust for Glory, making fun of the subtitle that had been put on the 1970 film Patton when it had been released in the UK. And so this little joke, based off of the Pythons all having a shared and strong mistrust of organized religion, started to snowball the more that they thought about it.
So they were just hanging out thinking, oh, let's make a comedy about Jesus? That is pretty bold. And with a title like Lust for Glory, no less. How does that turn into something digestible? There had to have been some sort of parameters around this. And I know we've talked about it a little bit when we were watching it. We had a watch party for this in the Discord, which was a lot of fun. And we kind of mentioned how it felt like they didn't really make fun of Jesus himself. So I'm curious, was that like an intentional decision from the start of conception? Or because a title like that doesn't seem like it?
Well, what starts out as a flippant joke eventually became a sketch that Idle and Jones worked on that was about Jesus' cross falling apart and Jesus being a carpenter, talking about how they could do a better job. But they quickly realized upon writing this sketch that Jesus was kind of a good guy in their opinion. John Cleese even said he's not particularly funny. What he's saying isn't mockable. It's very decent stuff. And so after initially aiming the barbs at Jesus, they made the conscious decision at this point to make fun of the New Testament era rather than to make fun of the Gospels specifically. even though they had this character who was living a parallel life to Jesus, because they understood that the comedy was not going to come from the teachings of Christ or the teachings of any prophet, really. The comedy was going to come from the ways in which those teachings had been bastardized over thousands of years. And so they drew the line very clearly at this point in the process that they wanted to make something that was heretical, but that wasn't blasphemous.
Ooh, heretical or blasphemous. I feel like we've got to dive into that because that is a very important distinction in this film.
The way I understand it, at least at my sort of finite understanding of religion, is that a heresy is something that you do that pokes fun at organized religion or undermines the authority of the church without necessarily going against the scriptures. Whereas a blasphemy is something that directly contravenes a specific divinity within a religion. Am I getting that right?
I believe so. That's how I have interpreted it as well. And I think that it's really good that you bring that up because Life of Brian is very particular on not being blasphemous, even though there are jokes about him getting prosecuted for blasphemy himself, ? And I think that's what makes the comedy so good and highbrow at some points. Drawing that line in the sand there of the types of jokes we're going to make is very important and breeded a lot of creativity in the jokes. That is kind of really what got me interested. I was very quick to want to write this off, but the moment I noticed that distinction, I got very interested. So I'm glad you brought that up, Jack.
Terry Jones put it better than I ever could when he talked about the conception of the character Brian, on which subject they even demurred from making him the 13th disciple. They just made him live a parallel life after stepping back from their initial concept over and over again, because according to Jones, Life of Brian wasn't about what Christ was saying, but about the people who followed him, the ones who for the next 2,000 years would torture and kill each other because they couldn't agree on what he was saying about peace and love. And that was the impetus for the writing of the script that would eventually become the first draft, which was the Gospel according to St. Brian in 1976. And so they really went to great pains in this writing process to respect the very difficult ground that they were treading upon, yet don't tell that to EMI Films, who was the original financier of this film, because that was not how they saw it.
Wait, you mean they weren't invested? Is this another situation where the studio was like, nah, this is crazy, we ain't going back this?
It is, but it's unlike anything I've ever seen in terms of how the plug got pulled, BK.
Whoa. What do you mean?
They had finished the first draft of the Gospel according to St. Brian in 1976, sent it to EMI. They didn't really read it. I mean, EMI Films had handled the Holy Grail. They just trusted these guys to do whatever they wanted to do. And as it got into its shooting script, it was ready to go. The crew is ready to go out to Tunisia to film the film. And then Bernard Delfont and the EMI execs finally read the script. And as Terry Gilliam put it, they pulled out on the Thursday, and the crew was supposed to leave for Tunisia on the Saturday. This was a disaster.
Oh my God. That's insane. That's way further down the line in production than I anticipated. Can you imagine? Things have already been paid? ? How did they turn this around? Is there some like angel investors or some sort of additional studio that picks it up, or someone brought onto the project maybe that changes their mind?
BK, this is the point in the process of making this film in which Life of Brian was saved by a beetle.
A beetle? Oh, you mean like the Beatles?
I do.
No. The music, the submarine guys? No.
You see, at this point, UK financing was basically considered dead by the Pythons, to the point where producer John Goldstone and Eric Idle both leave the UK for Hollywood at this juncture to sort of seek financing, but also kind of probing around for new projects. Now, by coincidence, Eric Idle's really dear friend, Beatle George Harrison, had just moved into town. And Harrison was possibly the biggest Monty Python fan that has ever lived. So Idle calls up Harrison just on the idea of, let me just call up the richest person I know. And he pitches the film to George. And Harrison loves the idea so much that he immediately picks up the phone and consults his business manager, Dennis O'Brien, who in turn, after hearing the pitch from Harrison, suggests that they fund the film themselves. And not only do they arrange a $5 million loan to finance Life of Brian, which, by the way, required Harrison to remortgage his English mansion, as well as O'Brien to remortgage his London offices, but they started handmade films almost exclusively because George wanted to see this film made. So, sight unseen, they create a production company to make this happen. George Harrison.
That's insane. Also, though, I kind of want to be like Harrison, bro. I want to have enough money just to be like, do you see this project? Look, yo, I love this so much. I'm going to remortgage one of my houses. God, this is so awesome. Okay, that's insane. That's insane.
To give you a picture of how unheard of this would be, based on the rising costs of film, this would be like getting a loan, sight unseen, of $40 million to get a film made in today's money.
Being honest, I'm trying to think about comedies that were really out during the time after the success of Monty Python Holy Grail. I think personally that something parodying Jesus in this nature at that stage where it was already written is got to be like, you knew, like you read it and you said this is a game changer.
It's also worth noting that it had a personal resonance to a number of the Pythons, because in July of 1977 in the UK, Mary Whitehouse, who at the time was the quote-unquote self-appointed guardian of national morals, won a blasphemy libel case against Gay News, which had just published a poem about a Roman centurion's homoerotic leanings towards Christ. And this had a personal resonance because Graham Chapman had helped launch this platform and was an ardent supporter of gay rights. And this was the first successful blasphemy lawsuit in the UK in 50 years. So in this climate where, though distant, there was a very real possibility that they would all be found guilty of blasphemy just for making this film, they pushed forward with it anyway. And they kind of worked within the counterculture here, if I can be honest. They sort of held that mantle of irreverence that the Beatles had had in the 60s and that they had held on to in the late 60s and early 70s, and brought it to this film by flying in the face of current events in the UK.
I quite frankly cannot believe that we are talking about someone getting prosecuted for blasphemy. And like, even though in the 70s, right? Like early 80s, right? This is 79. That's insane to me. Like, I can't even process that. That's a real offense? Are you mean to tell me what happened to separation of church and state?
You're not wrong to register offense to it, but those kind of religious legal standards do exist, or did exist, in certain European nations at the time, whereas the separation of church and state and the freedom of religion is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. That's not a guarantee in a lot of places, so they really were leaving themselves open. But at the end of the day, I kind of think the Pythons got the last laugh from this point onward, because from the start of production, this was really kind of a blessed film. As John Cleese put it, God smiles on some projects, and he absolutely smiled on Life of Brian.
That's got to be a good omen, you know, making a film involving religious motifs, you know. Let's have God smile on this one. I mean, what does he mean by that? Lots of successes, good, happy coincidences?
It's not just that there were a lot of successes in making the film efficiently, in a good shooting schedule, in a strong production and professional acumen on set, but it was that the Pythons really did learn from a lot of the mistakes that they made on Holy Grail, and they made great efforts to correct them. The first of which was making sure that Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam did not try to co-direct this after all of the problems they had had on set. So they found kind of an elegant solution, I think. Terry Jones took on the film as the sole director, and Terry Gilliam took charge of special effects and set design, creating the aesthetic for everything you see on screen.
Oh, wow. That makes sense why everything felt so cohesive, if I'm being honest. Having that one person in charge that has the vision can be able to execute across the board, especially when there was beef before. I mean, when you hand out that director title, people get entitled, you know what I'm saying?
You're not wrong about that, but it also really stands out in the way that they both kind of shine in how they direct and how they see the filmic art. Terry Jones is always more of a character and an actor's director. He's very good at understanding people's minutiae. Whereas Gilliam, as we saw earlier in this season with Brazil and last season when we covered 12 Monkeys, he is a very visual, very visceral director who has a very exacting focus on what he wants to see on the screen. And you see that when you see the detail on the matte painting when Brian has painted Romans Go Home in big letters on the facade of Pontius's palace. You see that detail when you look at the backdrops in the film. You see that in the way that Gilliam subtly sets up Pontius's chambers to look like a reclaimed synagogue in which Roman iconography has been placed over Jewish symbols. Just very subtle but very critical stuff that Jones doesn't have to focus on because he's getting the best comedic performances he can.
That's pretty good synergy, though, if you think about it. You understand your role and you bring in the ambiance. I mean, to be frank, I don't think some of the comedy would have hit as hard as it does if it didn't have the same level of immersion and dedication to the design and to the set. It's so easy to put that second rather than at equal standing with the performances. So it's so awesome to hear that.
More than that, BK, they benefited really strongly from prior productions in Tunisia because all of the sets they used were reused from Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, which was shot there in 1976 and 1977. And because these sets existed, and because the locals in Tunisia had worked on this with Zeffirelli, Life of Brian enlisted these same people to be extras and to fill out the crew. And while they did irritate Terry Jones with constant notes about, oh, this is not what Mr. Zeffirelli would have done, they did really make the film a very streamlined and very efficient process by giving them people on set and on crew who knew the land and knew how to shoot where they were.
Speaking of shooting where they were, the one thing that I kind of found, because I like that camera stuff, was that a lot of this movie was filmed on handheld because of where they were. They needed to actually operate with handheld cameras to be able to get a lot of the shots downtown, which I found very interesting. And going back being like, wow, I can't believe I didn't notice that. Man's got a steady hand.
I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that. When you think about the amount of space that was available in the ex-leper scene, when you think about the haggling scene, there isn't a lot of space to put that camera.
Not at all. But I'm glad you brought out some of my favorite scenes. I feel like it's a good time to kind of talk about them a little bit as we get into the creation and the BTS of stuff. That haggling scene is actually directly inspired by Eric Idle's actual experience with haggling, which I found so funny to kind of learn about. That he had an experience where he went out to get this carpet, this really long carpet. He spent 2 hours, went to lunch, came back, and the guy he was buying from said another price. And Eric said, no, I want the exact same price I said before, plus a cup of coffee. And he got it. So as you can see, the jokes write themselves. And really, that was probably one of my favorite bits throughout the film. So just to see how these comedians kind of pull from their own experiences and apply it to a cool set piece and then bring it out to something even further. They dragged that and it was so funny. I love learning things about that.
I think it really speaks to the way that they can draw from that personal experience because of how regimented and how stable the comedy is within Life of Brian's script. They really do move seamlessly from set piece to set piece in a very highly evolved and highly structured way. And it's a film that needed a stable hand, which the Pythons honestly weren't sure of, because the core of this film is Brian and Brian's naivete and his viewpoint on the world. And you need the right person to play that. But as they were getting out to Tunisia, they still weren't sure who was going to take the titular role.
I was going to ask, isn't it usually the Mighty Snake people? Don't they play all the characters themselves? Do they have a system on who's playing what, or do they come in with a vision?
Well, they do kind of have a loose system, at least when they were doing Flying Circus, of how they would decide who would play certain roles or what certain archetypes they needed from the performance. But there was a debate here on set over whether or not the role was going to go to John Cleese or Graham Chapman. Remember, I mentioned this for Holy Grail, not for nothing, but Graham Chapman had through the mid and late 70s really struggled with his alcoholism. And despite being the clear leading man of the group, he wasn't really the pair of safe hands that they needed at the time. And Cleese was actively advocating for the role so that he could bring the film that stability. But in a surprise that literally caught everybody off guard, Graham Chapman gave up drinking and got dry specifically so he could take on the role of Brian.
Wait, really? That is insane. I can't imagine someone just cold turkeying, giving up for a role like that. That role has to really mean a lot. And to hear that that was kind of a deciding factor to be able to stop drinking and take upon a role of this nature, I'm surprised. Were they called to it, or is there some sort of beef there? Like, do you know, Jack?
I think it all comes down to, or at very least the accounts on Life of Brian point to, it being Chapman being very motivated to play this role and to do it justice. Chapman, in many respects, is a tragic figure because of his early death, because of the fact that it would be complications from his alcoholism that would eventually lead to his death far, far too early, especially compared to how long-lived the Pythons have all been. But it's, in my opinion, I think a really special story and a great triumph in his life that he got dry enough to do this role and that he was motivated to bring this performance to the screen. And it was at the point, BK, where he was dry enough to act as an on-set doctor. He was a qualified doctor due to his time at Cambridge and due to the fact that he had gotten his certification while he was working as a sketch writer pre-Python. So it was this great reclamation of himself to be present on this set that I think is really important to note.
Wow. I'm astounded, and good for him to see that. I love that a creative work has motivated this type of reaction and to see teamwork in a sense, or just see all the kind of pieces come together. Because when you start to see everyone working to their strengths, especially Gilliam kind of leaning into the animation moments that happen in the film and learning about Eric Idle and all his work with the music and the ending of it. And I'm starting to see everyone playing to their strengths here. This is a film of synergy. Am I wrong?
I would almost say it's a film of kind of a divine serendipity about it. All the pieces just fell together seamlessly. Even when, obviously, 48 hours before the shoot, it looked like they might not have a film. Even that found a way to resolve itself by giving them the finances they needed for this film without it being a hand that wanted to overly interfere with what they were doing. They got the opportunity to make this comedy as a passion project, and they experienced one of the rarest things you can, I think, as a creative, which is to have a passion project go about as well as you could ever hope for.
I love hearing that. You know, I love hearing stories that are wins. And this one is, I'm kind of eager to talk about my little bit here before we kind of get into the reception of the film. There is a lot of stuff that kind of went into making it. And there's a lot of scenes that I think we've talked about as a community when we did have the watch party. And specifically, the one scene that stands out in this film, and that is the spaceship scene. Can we talk about that, Jack? What in God's name, I have to say it that way, was going on there? I want to know your thoughts before I give you what my research has shown me, because that was the biggest takeaway. After everything, and we were singing the always look on the bright side, right? All of that happened, and I still kept thinking about the spaceship scene.
As a preface, when I was showed this film far, far too early by my parents, as a little kid, the spaceship scene was my absolute favorite little break in the drama. But Gilliam gave his reasoning for it, and I think it's appropriately Python-esque, because keep in mind, they had always written their sketch show to basically not have sketches have an ending, just get to a particularly funny punchline and then find a way to move to the next thing. Gilliam puts it this way, that they had written Brian into an impossible situation, so they needed to give him an impossible solution. He just jumps from a tower, and suddenly he is involved in an interstellar conflict in 33 AD.
It's like the most isekai into another world situation. And granted, at the time, right, this is primo Star Wars, George Lucas, so could have been a little sub or a good little way to be like, hey, we're being contemporary and we're referencing pop culture. But what I found what was really cool was that it might have actually been a reference to another film that was out called The Silver Chalice, in which Simon Mangus jumps from a high tower to prove his divinity and undermine Christianity. He, in fact, does die. He is a false idol. But that illusion of Brian falling off the high tower also means that he is a false idol. And for me, the break in the spaceship scene gave me time to think about what I saw. And when I tell you that is when I realized what was going on and that we were Jesus parallels, that's like a fourth into the movie. And I didn't realize that he was a parallel to Jesus. So I kind of give it its props for the spaceship scene and Gilliam getting to flex and make some freaky little aliens. Also, ancient aliens, ? Maybe that was it too, because some people really believe in that, Jack.
Let it not be said that the Pythons are not well read. If there's a reference out there, they will have found a way to have baked it into their comedy if it was contemporary to their time. And I think it speaks to the quality of the humor, but I would be remiss if we didn't also mention, because we need to be responsible when talking about these films, that there are certain gags within it that do miss, that do fall flat.
Yes.
Particularly the scene with the jailers that was, oddly enough, one of the few ad-libbed scenes by the Pythons, in which there is humor that we would consider with modern eyes to be, ableist, and we consider to be a little bit derogatory. And it's worth noting that these exchanges exist both because the Pythons had the license to hit and miss in a way that just doesn't exist now, but also to note that they weren't perfect, and their comedy has had these affectations of controversy around it, not just because of the subject matter, but because sometimes it genuinely is in bad taste.
Oh, 100%. I'm really glad you brought that up because, again, after our watch party, we did have a whole, a dissection time where we kind of broke down things and talked about our stuff. And it's really important to talk about comedy, especially comedy that is dated in light of how we approach things and subject matters of this time. And I think that overall, the good outweighed the bad. And the bad didn't take away. And that is something to say because you watch some other movies and the bad can definitely take you out and take you away from the scene or the comedy or the emotions. And I don't feel like that was like that here in Life of Brian.
I agree with you on that. And again, I want to mention that I think the importance of something like this is that you get to see those misses in all of their kind of grotesque glory. You get to see the fact that people tried these bits of comedy and that they fall flat because it allows you to understand, I think, not just that these things aren't something that we consider funny in the modern day, but it gives you the space to consider, why don't I find this funny? What knowledge do I have that wasn't present in 1979 that makes this something that I don't consider palatable or don't consider to be very intelligent? And when you're able to make that analysis, I think it leads to a higher engagement of comedy overall, because while comedy is never about parsing out the individual jokes most of the time, when you're parsing out content, you're doing yourself the service of making yourself engage with as broad a perspective as possible to hold a belief in why something doesn't work. And I think that that speaks well when you look at it as a constructive criticism that positively moves us forward from the points we've been in the past.
Beautifully well said. And honestly, things that did stand out to me to that point were commentary on how women were treated at the time. And the jokes were really not perpetuating the treatment, but again, I feel in a humorous way, drawing light and poking fun of how ridiculous situations were at the time. And even when I thought maybe the humor was crossing a line, especially involving the revolutionary Stan who wants to be a woman to be called Loretta, I do think for the time, Life of Brian was being, quite frankly, pretty progressive in its interpretation of the subject matter. And I've been very curious to hear others' thoughts, other people in the trans community, how they feel about how this was handled in Life of Brian. Because for me, as someone who is in the LGBT community, I believe it could have been far worse. And quite frankly, genuinely interesting to see that Loretta was kind of accepted after the slightly comedic moment was brought up about the gender, and they accepted Loretta as a woman throughout the rest of the film. It's very interesting. So I gotta give Monty Python's bros a little a little bit of round of applause there for being what I think is kind of ahead of their time.
I think it gets to the core themes of this film, quite honestly, because in everything that they wrote and baked into Life of Brian, it fits with that idea of we want to be heretical, we don't want to be blasphemous. And I think they extend that beyond religion, and they try to, in most cases, extend that to the people that are being discussed. The lessons that Brian teaches people in this film are good lessons. The ideas of self-sufficiency, the ideas of being your own person. And the film isn't poking fun at him for believing these things, nor would it poke fun at anybody who believes in these positive qualities out of a good faith. It really reserves its worst barbs for people who are followers of organized religion. It pokes fun at the desperation for meaning, the desire for belonging, and the willingness to misinterpret real-world events as religious signs, that clinging on in that search for the meaning in life.
I'm glad you brought us there, because I think that that is really the message that I took away from this the most. There are a lot of great themes throughout the entirety of the film, but really the end of the film ends on that iconic song written for the film, which is always look on the bright side of life. And I think that's the message of how to live your life. There is this philosophy out there, I can't find the name of him, but they discuss the life of the mundane, the daily life, the ordinary life, your routine, and it being meaningless, and what that can bring to behavior and how people can act because of that life. And really the film does a great kind of commentary or parody on that theme, I believe, bringing up a lot of instances where things become procedural, like the Colosseum, and everything is very, I don't know, ordinary, which should be ridiculous, or over the top, where it seems very matter of fact that this is the everyday. I think you walk away with that film kind of thinking about what is the meaning of life, with an ending so powerful like that, and very shocking for someone who comes from a religious background, you know, seeing someone, or not just someone, seeing multiple people on crucifixes singing and dancing about looking on the bright side while hanging to their death is a very provocative statement. And I think it forces you to look inwardly and contemplate, what are the bright sides of your life? How hard is it for you? Are you bringing meaning? And I don't know, I walked away from that more contemplative than anticipated for a comedy film, Jack. I did not know that we were going to get into such deep and provocative thought experiments.
I think that that's a really astute observation about the way that the film's, at least its most comfortable characters, carry on their daily life. They don't really question the world around them. They just sort of live through the mundanity and make the most of their surroundings. And it's really the people who try to rise above it to make the world seem more important, for whom this film has the sharpest barbs. I mean, it has a lot to say, I think, in a very pointed way, about the disorganized nature of rebellion in the modern world, and in particular, the segmenting of leftist opposition groups in the modern day in the face of encroaching conservatism, particularly at this time when the UK was about to put in Thatcher and the US was about to put in Reagan. It had a lot to say about that opposition to conservatism.
Can you break that down for me more? I'm trying to see that, because I feel like I know what you mean in comparison to the film. I think that's very strong. So I'm interested to hear a little more about that.
Well, it really bases itself primarily upon an observation by the Pythons that in the 70s, particularly in England, a lot of primarily liberal groups in the UK would spring up in opposition to conservative government. But these organizations predominantly, and we see this with modern leftist movements as well, they almost seem to be more at each other's throats and hate each other way more than they hated their common enemy. And you see this directly lampooned in the scene where the People's Front of Judea goes to kidnap Pontius Pilate's wife, only to run into the Free People of Galilee executing the exact same plot. And when Brian extols upon them while they're having a melee with each other, we need to stand up and unite against the common enemy, they stop and go, the Judean People's Front! They can't even decide that the Romans are their common enemy, and all the while, a bunch of Roman centurions just watch them killing each other and just smirk as these organizations go by the wayside. And it's a very cutting rebuke of the way that those political organizations in the UK would not unify around common purpose, but were almost too caught up in their own egoism to push good ideas and good values effectively in a political manner. You even see it reaffirmed throughout the film. At the very end, when Brian's being put up on the crucifix, Judith desperately wants them to stop debating. And in order to stop debating, they have to pass a resolution to stop debating. It's just all infighting, and it's all about the pointlessness of these political movements.
Okay, I see it now, and you're 100% correct. It makes sense. The moment you started giving those examples, I was like, okay, yeah. They were fighting against each other. It was a bunch of talking and not doing anything. I think also it kind of touches on the idea of like the hive mind as well, or the mob mentality is probably the actual term, especially when you see they're trying to release somebody and they're just like saying a random name and everyone just agrees with it. Or the gourd, the mighty gourd. It's all just immediately, let me worship this. If one person does it, I'm going to do it. And I think that is always so easy to depict. But I feel like Life of Brian does it so well because it shows another level of that. It has a very strong social commentary as to why the people are behaving that way. I don't know if you saw that too as well, Jack.
I think the reason, at least from my opinion, that it's so successful at doing that is that at the very core of this script, it tackles an extremely challenging theme to depict, which is the corruption and bastardization of high ideals. I mean, you mention it in the context of my favorite scene in the film, which is when Byron becomes this unwitting prophet and it's follow the shoe, no, ignore the shoe, follow the gourd. Brian's this really earnest kid who has this almost kind of beautiful viewpoint on the world, and you're grounded as a viewer in his viewpoint. You live through his naivete, and in part, that's why the humor around him is so well served, because he's such a beautiful straight man who believes in this platonic ideal of existence. The conflict comes from others hearing his words or the words of authorities in their lives and clinging to them. The need that they have for teachings to have a specific resonance to their own personal experiences. And so when Brian says something, it's not allowed to be taken as he meant it by anybody in the film, from his mother to his followers that spring up. These words have to be filtered through the prism of understanding and lose their real meaning. And that's what Brian can't defeat overall. For all the positive things that he wants to live and try to even impart upon people, they will always fall upon deaf ears.
Nobody will actually listen. And listening is not trying to interpret. And I think that's a great commentary. As someone who is very religious, who does believe in a lot of scriptures, I think the biggest problem for organized religion is that they often teach the interpretation rather than the lessons themselves, listening to what is said rather than listening to what has been interpreted and trying to find additional meaning. A lot of times, some of these lessons are very straightforward and are meant for self-interpretation, but not in the way that I guess you see it in reality, which is this grandiose, deep understanding that the cosmos is trying to speak to you. I know I'm getting a little tangent here, but when it comes to astrology, I feel this way too a little. The planets aren't telling me what to do, but I do find some sort of meaning in knowing my sign and knowing those themes, but I'm not letting it define me. And I think that's kind of what this film brings up, is understanding versus being defined by that understanding, being a free thinker. It really opens up your mind as the viewer to genuinely challenge you to think for yourself. Honestly, I think this film kind of almost shames you into forcing you to feel bad that you are not self-reflective enough in your mentality. I don't know. Maybe that's just me reading into it, but...
Well, I think it also pokes fun at people in a really Freudian way. You know, it was Sigmund Freud who observed sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And I think that that's the problem that Brian deals with for the entire film. The cigar can never be just the cigar with Brian. And honestly, in the reception of this film, BK, Brian was not allowed to just be Brian, because, as you might expect in the late 70s, a film that parallels the life of Christ in an era of evangelical upswell, kind of a problem for the Pythons.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know, I'm not the history buff here, but in my mind, I'm thinking about probably my grandparents' heyday. And let's just say I think they would have been outraged at something like this.
Well, it comes out in the U.S. first, in part because, as I mentioned with the White House lawsuit, the Pythons were a little bit worried about catching a blasphemy charge. So, opening in the U.S. market was a conscious decision because they wanted to try and avoid some of the flack they would get over in the U.K. But after it premiered, it would be hit almost immediately by a critique of Rabbi Abraham Hecht, who at the time was the president of the Rabbinical Alliance of America, and he decried it as essentially being, his words, produced in hell. And so this led American evangelical leaders to come out of the woodwork to criticize the film, often sight unseen. As Gilliam put it, we managed to get the Catholics, the Protestants, and the Jews all pissed off at us. The crucifixion scene in particular did it every time. And yet, in a lot of cases, actual churchgoers, not these evangelical firebrands, but parishioners, didn't seem to have that much of a problem with the film. They kind of made the distinction as an audience that it was heretical and not blasphemous. And as a result, these critiques of the film became bigger than the film, much in the way they did for Texas Chainsaw Massacre in '74. And the protests drove the awareness of the film and made it more money.
I see it now. I mean, I even kind of hinted at it earlier about the crucifixion scene, where it is that strong iconography, I guess, bastardized in a sense. And that is going to really rub people the wrong way and force them to challenge their focus. I don't know how to say. You've got to break your mind's constraints if you're someone who's so grounded in that evangelical lifestyle, to separate your mind from what you're seeing and what's being said versus what you know, and really digest it in earnest. So it's comforting to hear that at the time, real churchgoers saw it the way I did, and to see that people who maybe come from a higher standing, who are more in it, assumed the worst, I guess. To me, it sounds like they never really paid attention. Like, you weren't really locked in. You were only superficially watching it. I don't know. Is that crazy to think?
I don't think you're off base for suggesting that whatsoever. And I think that there was a lot of charged and divisive reaction to the film, not just in the United States, but when the film got over to Europe. I can think of no better example than the film being banned in Norway. Meanwhile, in Sweden, they decided to market the film as being so funny that it was banned in Norway.
Sweden's lit, dog.
I love that story. I just think it's a hilarious little bit of marketing by the Swedes. Probably the most difficult and ardent opposition this film faced was within the UK, within the Python's home. Firstly, UK religious groups sought to deny the film a certification, a campaign that failed and ultimately helped the film garner the biggest opening weekend box office in history to that point, surpassing Jaws. But it was something that would cascade throughout the country, where many townships would just straight up ban the film even before viewing it. And it culminated in a very famous debate on BBC television on the Friday night, Saturday morning program, hosted by, believe it or not, BK, Tim Rice of Jesus Christ Superstar fame.
No way. I'm curious, what was the debate about? Whether it was blasphemous or not?
I wish I could say it was an enlightening debate on those subjects and that common ground was tried to reach, because the Pythons, John Cleese and Michael Palin, who did this debate, came in very well versed, did their biblical studies, did their religious history studies, and came in to parry points made about religion from the representatives of the religious order, who were Mervyn Stockwood, the Bishop of Southwark, and satirist Malcolm Muggeridge. And instead, Stockwood and Muggeridge, as it turned out, had been 15 minutes late to the screening, had missed all the segments making it clear that Jesus existed in the world, and they believed Brian to be a direct reference to Jesus. And so they spent the entire time arguing in bad faith, taking childish snipes at the Pythons. And what could have been an enlightening discourse, in retrospect, is, as Cleese put it, and I agree with him, really kind of a boring debate.
That's so unfortunate, because I feel like the film would have really valued from a genuine discussion about it, not something that sounds like really petty, in my opinion. I can't believe 15 minutes late. That's the whole premise. You are going to definitely miss the time that they took at the beginning of the film off top to let people know, to let y'all know that this ain't Jesus, how you gonna walk into the movie after that point and be like, yeah, it is Jesus?
I think in a way it kind of reaffirms the justness of the Pythons to poke fun at this particular segment of society, that segment being people who are innately involved in organized religion, because they came into this debate with a smugness and an arrogance about the subject matter despite not completely engaging with it. And they conducted themselves with that air. And it's astonishing to watch in retrospect to see these people who purport to represent God and represent the church conduct themselves on British national television in such a childish manner. And it's something that I would, if it was a good discussion, I would tell people to go on YouTube and find it, but I can't in good faith recommend it because it's not a substantive discussion. It is something that quickly devolves into two parties going after each other in very personal ways. And while the Pythons maintain to this day that the film is heretical and not blasphemous and that they're not trying to destroy anyone's faith, they've never been able to, in a very public way, engage with members of the church in good faith and discuss the film.
I wonder if there was a film that came out around our time, would it have the same interaction? I'm just curious if the film came out now, would we get a better response or reception? And quite frankly, I don't think so, which is kind of depressing because I think we are in need of a new age Monty Python, a new age of Life of Brian.
I agree with you, but I think one of the reasons that we would all do well for that kind of energy to show up again, and that we all desperately want that, is because it's impossible to discuss the legacy of this film outside of the legacy of Python. It's one of the greatest comedy films of all time, made by quite possibly the greatest comedic collective of all time. I mean, just look at who these guys have influenced. It's almost redundant to put these names down, but they were direct comedic influences on the likes of Robin Williams, Sacha Baron Cohen, Rowan Atkinson, Mike Myers, Weird Al, Jim Carrey, Simon Pegg, and John Oliver. You want to get even deeper into it, they have been a direct influence on the 3 longest-running American animated shows of all time. Because Matt Groening from The Simpsons, Matt Stone and Trey Parker from South Park, and Seth MacFarlane from Family Guy all had direct inspiration growing up from watching the Pythons. Perhaps it's Oliver who puts it best, and we've relied on quotes a lot this episode, but I think this one's particularly resonant. Writing about the importance of Monty Python is basically pointless. Citing them as an influence is almost redundant. It's assumed. This strange group of wildly talented, appropriately disrespectful, hugely imaginative, and massively inspirational idiots changed what comedy could be for their generation and for those that followed. There is no modern comedy without Monty Python, BK. And that is the legacy, I think, of this film at the end of the day, is that it is part of this beautiful comet that streaked across the sky and gave us a whole new perspective on the art form.
My mind is blown because you just started naming people that I know those people, Jack. I know those people. I know those things. And now that I'm understanding Monty Snakethons, it's the same thing. Sketch comedy. I love it. I just want to love them more. And I think that I need more exposure because there are just some jokes that I just don't get, Jack. And I feel so bad and people are going to hate me. Ah!
I don't think that's what you miss out as not being a Python fan. I think what it comes down to, honestly, is it's the way that if you love Monty Python, that you relate Python to other people. Because you can't just tell people the name of a Monty Python sketch. You have to recite lines from it, and you have to act it out, and you have to try as hard as you can to share this humor that you've been given as quickly as possible and give it to others because it brings you so much joy. I'm reminded of, there's a story my father has told me about the first time one of his roommates in college saw the Spanish Inquisition sketch from the show. And it wasn't enough for him to just say, oh my goodness, this Monty Python show is hilarious. He ran breathlessly into the dorm room, side-splitting laughter, going through the sketch. Our chief weapons are surprise, surprise and fear and surprise. Our 2 chief weapons and just reciting the whole thing for my dad and his friends that he was with at the time. And that's what Python is, I think, at its base level. It's not just that it's hilarious comedy. It's a comedy that you have to share, that you have to give to other people. And so I think that what you miss out if you're not a fan of Python isn't the jokes. It is the camaraderie of being part of that joke tradition. It's being part of that camaraderie that comes with liking something that is on the cutting edge. And I think that's why it's something that 50 years on from its genesis continues to attract people to it.
I am super intrigued. I think I need more exposure. And I think to one of our community members' points, and I think you've said this too, which is why you enjoy the comedy styles of Monty Python, is that you kind of just got to let yourself go and just experience it. Some hit, some miss. And I think that we're not used to doing that anymore. We don't really have media like that anymore, where we're hit with different bits and different sketches left and right, left and right. And as someone, who works in comedy now with Rooster Teeth and Achievement Hunter and things of that nature, I've been more open to understanding that world. It's a brand new world to me. And I'm so excited that Life of Brian is really, I think, the first entry point into that. Now I'm invested in finding out what this whole Holy Grail nonsense is, Jack. Like, do I have supplemental content I need to watch before I get into that? Because I'm tired of people quoting this thing and I have no context.
If you're boned up on your Arthurian legends and Excalibur and all the Holy Grail and all that good noise, you will be in good shape.
I know none of that.
Well, I would say you have a little bit of folklore to look at in that case.
Got it.
I will say it's not lost on me the irony that you talked about one of the big themes of this film being the search for the meaning of life, and the fact that the Python's last film is 1983's The Meaning of Life.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. I said that without knowing that, Jack. I had no idea.
Oh, no, I know. That's why I was waiting to drop it on you.
Oh my God, boom, you give me a bomb at the end of the episode. How are you going to do that to me? Because, holy cow, because the whole time I'm sitting there thinking, and I'm like, well, that's really what religion is. And Jesus and people are trying to find meaning in their lives and existence. And oh my gosh, okay, well, now I got to go through the whole Monty Snakethon collection so I can know all the things.
I can just close by saying I'm deeply jealous of the fact that you get to go on that journey, but my heart is warmed by the fact that I could show you Life of Brian and that that's something that you want to do now. So this is a success for me. Even if some of the stuff didn't land for you that lands for a lot of Python fans, I'm happy to know that a lot did.
Oh, 100%. This is definitely not low on the list. This is 100% something that I'd watch again. Definitely high rewatchability, especially with how awesome most of the jokes are. But I would be remiss to not say that it's not in my top, but has genuinely sparked my intrigue in diving into comedy. I am rejuvenated. I have interest in it now. I can see how good and weird and fun it can be and not just slapsticky. I think that's what's really good from Monty Python, at least in what we saw with Life of Brian, is there can be kind of slapstick humor, but that isn't all that comedy is. There's a lot of layers, a lot of depth, and Life of Brian really does show that. So, Jack, thank you for picking such an amazing film to introduce me to Monty Python and bring into the pod. I've had such a blast chatting all the things. I did not think we were going to be getting into any religious adjacent anything on this podcast, but here we did.
It's a method to my madness, but having said that, I'm very glad that we could watch something that is as flippant and is as silly as this in preparation for what we've got coming up next week, because we are switching gears and we're doing something I would say is a little bit special for the podcast. It is finally time for us to jump into the world of documentary filmmaking, and we're starting off with a documentary that is probably unlike anything you've ever seen.
Yes, I am fascinated at this pick that we have up because, Jack, you laid it up so beautifully. And I love my documentaries on my own time. I watch a lot of weird documentaries about Mormons. We'll talk about that later. But I'm ready to dive into it critically. I've never really discussed a documentary with someone before. And anything that is involving, I would have to say, civil liberties is something I'm fascinated in. So, Jack, why don't you tee up what you've selected for our next episode?
BK mentioned that we are going to be looking into some social struggles and into some labor struggles. We are going to be watching the documentary Harlan County, USA. And for those of you who are not familiar, It is a documentary that focuses in on the 1973 Brookside mine strike, when miners in Harlan County, Kentucky, would go on strike to protest absolutely squalid, fetid living conditions that the mining company had forced them into. And it becomes a real human drama about the fight of this union, not just to fight for what they believe is right in this strike, but in a kind of a chilling preview of where labor relations would go in the intervening 50 years, they would be fighting against the union's right to even be recognized. And so it is a human drama that I feel is more necessary than ever to view, not just because it shows you the plight of working Americans and it shows you the difficulties they go through, but it has a unique way of showing how solidarity can be found through struggle. So as a documentary, as a uniquely shot and experiential documentary, I don't think we could have found a better place to get into the art form than Harlan County.
I am thrilled. I loved finding out that Barbara Coble, a female director, has actually done this. And if you do want to get ahead of the game and watch this yourself, it's not that long of a watch. It's actually on HBO Max, available there, as well as the Masters of Filmmaking, some BTS with the director. So highly recommend for you to get in on it and watch it so you can get in on the conversation when that episode drops. I'm so excited to check it out. And if you have any other questions and you want to geek out with us about Monty Snake Thons, the Mighty Viper Thons.
Come on. You can give me one proper Monty Python. Come on.
Mighty Morphin Thons. Okay, the Mighty Pythons. The Mighty Pythons. If you want to talk about them, you know you can find us there at Twitter, RFN_podcast, or on Instagram at Revenge of the Film Nerds. And tell me how terrible I made you feel with all of my bastardized Monty Viper heroes, the third. I love making funny names. Maybe I'll come up with some more ones when this comes out for promotional material.
It's like claws on a chalkboard, folks.
I'm sorry to subject you, but seriously, if you have any other questions you want to geek out with us, put us on, tell us your favorite bits and sketches, or let us know any other documentaries that you're excited to get into as we kind of venture into docs for our first time. We're always open to suggestions and layups. We've been doing a lot of rogue screenings with the community. So if you want any of those details to get on our community viewings, when we share some of our podcast films with the community, as well as just some of our favorites, again, you can always find us on Twitter at RFN_podcast. That is where we are most responsive, and we want to hear from you. We love doing this. And honestly, I think I had a really fun time doing this episode, Jack. You went off today, and I was entranced and enamored by learning everything about the Monty Snake-agins.
I take my comedy seriously.
We love to hear it. Well, thank you for hanging out with us. I hope you all enjoyed another fantastic episode of Revenge of the Film Nerds. That is it for us today, and we'll see you around next time.
Take care, everybody. Have a good holiday.
Bye-bye.